Hi everyone, I'm some guy who thinks he can cook, and today I want to show you how to braise anything. So the first thing that we're going to be asking ourselves is, what is a braise? Thankfully, some people a lot smarter than us have already come up with the answer to that. So let's see what the Reverse Gastronomique has to say about the topic. We flip over to the bees, we can see that a braise is a moist cooking method using a little liquid barely simmering at low temperature on the top of the stove or in the oven. It's pretty broad. That leaves a lot of room to work with. So with that in mind, let's jump to it. Let's see what we're going to be working with today. So a braise really has 5 parts that we have to be worried about. We have to think about our vegetables, our protein, the herbs, our liquid, and the last of all, our time. So for the vegetables, we have a classic mirepoix. We're going to go with some carrots, some celery, onion, and some mushrooms on top of that. For our herbs, we have a mix of some fresh sage, fresh thyme, tarragon, garlic, as well as shallot. For our liquid, we're going to mix it up, do a bit of a complex mix today. We have some canned tomatoes, chicken broth, and a bottle of red wine. For this, nothing fancy, you can use whatever you like. As for the protein today, we're going to be braising a chuck roast, which we have right here up front. Now for the time, you can either go low and slow, or you can speed it up by turning the temperature up a bit. I'm thinking that we're going to do about 300 degrees for, I think, 4 hours, but of course, as with any long-term cooking project, we're just going to have to check that out, see how it goes as we progress, and maybe make some changes here and there, but this at least gives us a solid place to start. So, the very first thing that we're going to want to do is get our vegetables all nice and chopped up. So right here in one container, I've got our carrots, our celery, onions, and the mushrooms all chopped up. Nothing too fine, it can be a bit rough. We're going to be cooking this for a while, so they're definitely going to be cooking down. Over here in this container, I've got just our shallots and 3 cloves of garlic, just smashed, rough chop, same thing as before. And from now, we're going to move over to the stove, toss these in a Dutch oven, and just sweat them for a little bit. Now we're over here at the stove. We've got our Dutch oven over medium-low heat. That's getting nice and warm. The very first thing that we want to do, toss some butter in there. And don't be shy with the butter, using quite a bit. We need that to lubricate all the ingredients as we go, and fat is essential for conveying flavors throughout the dish itself. So, the butter's in there, nice and low, so we're letting that melt pretty slow. Take a minute for that. While that's melting, once we've got a nice coating all along the bottom, next thing we're going to do, take our veggies, just toss them right in. Now, we want this to be a low heat. We're not trying to get any color. This is just for a nice sweat to get all the vegetables glistening a bit. So, you want to stir these around. It'll probably take a few minutes. These carrots especially, they're pretty tough. But just let this go for a while, and we'll move on to the next step after this. I forgot to mention something important. So, one of the main ideas behind the sweat is that we want to start drawing some moisture out of the food. And an important part of that is actually going to be played by some salt. So we want to take some salt, kosher salt, nice good pinch, just sprinkle that all over the veggies. That's going to help these sweat nice and evenly and start to lose some of the moisture, which is going to be important later on once we start adding our own back in. Back over here on the stove, we can see that our vegetables have been sweating for about 5-10 minutes now, and they've lost a lot of volume. Those onions, the celery starting to look nice and translucent, so at this point, we're going to take our shallots and our garlic, just dump that right in there. Want to mix it around a bit, and now just let that keep going for another few minutes while we prepare the steak. Over here on the next burner, we've got some butter melted in a cast iron skillet over medium heat. Now what we're going to do here is just brown our steak very briefly on both sides. Now this step is optional, but you really get the most flavor out of your meat if you brown it a little before putting it in the braise. So what I've done is I chopped the steak up, cut it in half, liberally salted both sides, and then patted it dry. So first piece, just going to go in like that. Going to let that sit for a few minutes, let it develop a nice brown, flip it over, and then reserve it to the side. Now we want to do this to every piece of meat we have. If we were using cubed meat, you'd want to do this in a pan, stir it up around, make sure that each side gets a nice golden brown color on it. The brief browning of the steak is done. Our veggies are still on the stove, sweating at a nice low heat. The oven is quickly approaching about 300, 325 as we speak, so now it's time to begin making our sauce, the actual liquid that we're going to be braising that roast in. So, what I have here is our can of tomatoes, lid off, and you might be thinking, whole tomatoes? It's not quite a liquid. Well, that's where this thing comes in. You can do this in a blender, a food processor. You could even chop this up really fine by hand, but I prefer the stick blender. This is nice and quick, so we're just gonna stick this right in here and blend these to a choppy but still liquid consistency. Alright, so that's done. The good thing about these tomatoes, no skin. Now, if I really wanted to, I could sieve out the seeds, but I don't mind them that much, and this is supposed to be more of a casual recipe that you can make anytime. So, now that we've got the tomatoes done, let's go back to the pot and begin assembling our sauce. So now we're back over here at the stove. We've got our pot with all of our veggies and our aromatics still going at a nice medium-low temperature right there. I'm going to give these one quick last stir, and now it's time to move on to the planting. So, this can of tomatoes, it's 28 ounces, a little over a pound and a half. We're just going to dump the whole thing in. This is going to be the primary liquid that we're using here. So, we're going to dump the pan in. That's, of course, going to immediately come to a stop right there. So we'll turn the heat up to a medium high. Let that start to return up to a nice temperature. Stir in the veggies. And from here, got some chicken stock. Of course, homemade is better, but when I can't be bothered to make my own stock, I prefer this brand. The main thing that you want to look out for, check the ingredient list. Here you should see actual chicken, actual celery, actual carrots, not powders, not concentrates. This isn't ideal, but it'll work pretty good for what we're doing today. So as this comes back up to a nice high temperature, we just want to pour in, I'm not even going to measure this, it doesn't have to be much. Say that's about half a cup right there. Give that a stir. Let's see how solid that seems. Alright, that doesn't quite have the consistency that I'm looking for. We want this to be thick, but running pretty smoothly. So, you know what I'm going to do? We just want to throw in a little bit more stock. There we go. Perfect. Alright, right now, the liquid is coming back up to a boil pretty rapidly. There's some bubbles forming on the surface. We want to let this just go for a few seconds, make sure we're actually boiling, and then from here we can move on to the next step, the final phase of our liquid additions. Got some red wine. Our liquid's been reducing here on the stove for about 15 minutes at a very high heat, and we've gone down by about a third volume-wise. It's pretty thick when you stir it, so the next thing we're going to do is give it a little taste to make sure our seasonings are alright. very good, but we definitely need some salt, so I'm just going to put in a nice big pinch of that sprinkled on top. Also going to take this time to crack on a little bit of pepper. Next, it's time to finally add those herbs that we were talking about earlier. Right here, I've got about a half tablespoon of tarragon, dried. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite find fresh stuff, but I'll just put that right on top. Next, some sage. Got a few big sprigs of that. You could take off the stems, you could chop this up. I'm going to remove it at the end, so I don't really care. We're just going to throw the whole thing on. Next, some thyme. Got about 4 big pieces of thyme. Same thing with the sage. Just going to add that in right on top. Want to fold that into the mixture, get it nice and incorporated. Next thing we're going to do, want to take our steak that's been resting on the side this whole time, just put that in. Make sure to kind of push it around to the bottom, get it nice and covered in the sauce. Remember, this is supposed to be a wet cooking method. Alright, so while the steak is in the sauce, the next thing we're going to do, our oven's been preheating to 325. Just want to put a lid on our pot. Open up the oven. Make sure we have our oven mitts on and toss that in. And I'm thinking that that's going to go for about 3 or 4 hours, but I'm going to set a timer for 2 and come back and check it then. It's been about 2.5 hours since we put the roast in the oven, and we're back in the kitchen. Things are looking like they're done. I've got some rice on the stove. Let's take a closer look to see how this turned out. So in the pot, it might not look the prettiest, but this right here is exactly what we're trying to go for. We can see that our sauce reduced by about 2/3 since we've put it in. It's nice and thickened up in that time. Now let's check out the meat. This is exactly the type of texture that we want. It's falling apart while still kind of having a little firmness to it. It's been a few hours now, and it's finally time to sit down and eat this amazing meal that I made today. Now, today, I braised a chuck roast in a tomato sauce, but you can braise anything using the methods that we talked about today, as long as you keep in mind the 5 parts of a braise: the vegetables, the herbs, the protein, your liquid, and the thyme. You too can braise anything. Using this same method, I've braised chicken, pork, even cabbage. Now, as long as you stick to those principles and be sure to give it the time that it really needs in the oven, you too can have an amazing meal just like this. Well, I'm about to dig in. I'll see you next time.